Welcome to Night Whispers. Tonight, you can relax, let your thoughts slow down, and allow the night to settle in. Here, you will hear calm, paranormal stories. Stories based on real experiences, quiet places, strange encounters, and things that cannot always be explained. There are no loud sounds here, no sudden noises, just a calm voice, the darkness, and the whispers of the night. I noticed the house most clearly when I stopped doing anything. At first, I didn't think of it that way. I just knew that the moments when I sat still felt different from the moments when I moved. When I walked through the rooms, when I opened drawers, turned lights on and off, the house behaved like any other. Floors creaked where floors creak. Walls remained walls. Space stayed where it was supposed to be. But when I sat down and did nothing, the house changed. It wasn't immediate. There was always a delay, a quiet pause, as if the space around me needed time to adjust to the absence of movement. I would sit on the couch, hands resting loosely in my lap, eyes unfocused, and wait. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the air would begin to feel thicker. Not heavier, not warmer or colder. Just more present. As if the room had decided to exist more fully now that I wasn't interfering with it. I moved into the house at a time in my life when stillness came easily. I didn't have much to do. No urgent responsibilities. No one waiting for updates or explanations. The days passed quietly, and I let them. The house seemed to appreciate that. During the first week, I spent most evenings sitting in the living room with the lights low, listening to the subtle sounds of the building settling into itself. Pipes whispered occasionally. Wood shifted with temperature. Nothing unusual. Still, there was a pattern I couldn't ignore. Whenever I reached for my phone, whenever I stood up or changed position, the feeling faded. The air loosened. The room became ordinary again. But when I put the phone down, when I rested back and allowed myself to remain still, the sensation returned. It was as if the house responded to my inactivity. I told myself it was psychological. Old buildings have a way of drawing attention inward. Silence can make you aware of things you normally filter out. The mind fills gaps when there's nothing else to focus on. That explanation satisfied me during the day. At night, it felt less convincing. The first night I noticed it clearly, I was lying in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Sleep hadn't come yet, but I wasn't restless either. I was suspended somewhere between alertness and rest, letting thoughts drift without direction. That was when the house reacted. The air changed first. It became denser, closer to my skin. I could feel it along my arms, my neck, my face. Not touching, not pressing. Just existing nearer than before. I remained still. Seconds passed. Maybe minutes. Time felt stretched, thinned out, difficult to measure. The longer I stayed motionless, the more defined the sensation became. It felt like a tension. Not focused. Not sharp. Diffuse. Everywhere at once. I became acutely aware of my breathing, of how even the smallest movement seemed too loud, too disruptive. I resisted the urge to shift position, curious to see what would happen if I didn't. The house responded by growing quieter. Not silent. Intentional. The usual background noises faded into something smoother, more controlled. It was as if the structure itself was adjusting, minimizing unnecessary sound to match my stillness. I closed my eyes. The sensation deepened. I slept after that, but it wasn't deep sleep. It was layered, fragmented, filled with moments of awareness between dreams. Each time I surfaced briefly, the presence was still there, unchanged, waiting patiently for me to settle again. Morning came without drama. Sunlight softened everything. The house looked exactly as it had before. Solid. Harmless. Ordinary. But I knew better. The following days confirmed it. Whenever I slowed down, whenever I paused long enough for my thoughts to empty, the house responded. Rooms felt closer, more defined. Corners seemed less distant. Even the hallway outside the bedroom felt narrower when I stood still long enough. Movement dispersed it. Stillness invited it. I began experimenting, though I didn't think of it that way at the time. I would sit in different rooms and remain as motionless as I could, timing how long it took for the sensation to appear. It was always the same. Roughly a minute of stillness. Sometimes less. The house didn't react to me sitting down. It reacted to me staying. At night, this effect intensified. Darkness removed distractions. Sounds became minimal. The boundary between my awareness and the space around me felt thinner. One night, as I lay in bed, breathing slow and shallow, I realized something unsettling. The house wasn't responding to my presence. It was responding to my absence of action. As if movement kept it dormant. As if stillness allowed it to wake. The thought stayed with me as sleep finally took me, heavy and slow. And somewhere in the quiet structure around me, the house continued to wait. I stopped trying to explain it to myself after that. Not because I couldn't find the right words, but because every explanation felt smaller than what was actually happening. The house didn't behave like something that needed to be understood. It behaved like something that needed to be accommodated. So I adjusted. I began structuring my days differently, not consciously at first. I simply noticed that I delayed tasks that required movement. I sat longer before standing. I lingered in doorways. I paused between actions, allowing moments of stillness to stretch. Each pause was answered. The house didn't react immediately anymore. It no longer needed the full minute. Sometimes only a few breaths were enough. I would sit down, relax my shoulders, let my hands rest, and the air would change. It was subtle, but consistent. The presence expanded gently, like a tide that had learned the shoreline. It never rushed. It never surprised me. It simply arrived, every time, as if responding to a rule I hadn't known I was teaching it. At night, the effect deepened. Darkness removed the last distractions. Without light, without sound, stillness became complete. When I lay awake and allowed my thoughts to slow, the house responded with remarkable precision. Walls felt closer. Ceilings felt lower. The space between objects felt deliberate. I wasn't being crowded. I was being defined. I noticed that the house never reacted when I shifted position abruptly. If I turned over too quickly, if I reached for the blanket or adjusted my pillow, the sensation faded instantly, as if startled by the movement. But when I remained still afterward, it returned, slightly stronger than before. As if rewarded. I began sleeping on my back, arms relaxed at my sides, breathing slow and even. It wasn't the most comfortable position, but it felt appropriate. Aligned. The house seemed to prefer it. In those moments, I felt suspended between the structure beneath me and the darkness above. My awareness stretched outward, touching the edges of the room without resistance. The house didn't push back. It accepted. During the day, I noticed small changes that I couldn't fully explain. Sound seemed more controlled, less chaotic. Even outside noise filtered in differently, softened and diffused. The house acted like a barrier, not blocking the world entirely, but moderating it. Inside, time lost its sharpness. Hours slipped by unnoticed when I remained still. When I moved, time snapped back into focus, reminding me of schedules and sequences. Stillness dissolved those boundaries again. I stopped checking the clock. The house didn't need me to measure time. One afternoon, I sat in the bedroom with the curtains drawn, letting the dim light settle evenly across the walls. I didn't move for a long time. Long enough that my body began to feel distant, less important than the space it occupied. The presence grew stronger than ever before. Not oppressive. Not overwhelming. Complete. For the first time, I felt the clear impression that the house was no longer reacting to me moment by moment. It had learned enough to anticipate me. The air shifted before I consciously relaxed. The stillness deepened before my thoughts fully emptied. The house was adapting faster. That realization should have unsettled me. Instead, it brought a strange calm. There was no hostility in the process. No urgency. The house wasn't pushing me toward anything. It was simply refining the conditions under which it existed most comfortably. And those conditions required me to do less and less. At night, I began waking less frequently. When I did wake, it was without confusion or fear. I would open my eyes, recognize the darkness, and feel the presence already settled into place, steady and familiar. I stopped questioning it. I allowed it. The house seemed to respond by becoming quieter still. Even the subtle sounds of settling faded, replaced by a smooth, continuous silence that felt intentional rather than empty. In that silence, my thoughts slowed to the point where they no longer felt like individual ideas. They blended together, forming a soft awareness that drifted without direction. I understood then that the house wasn't waiting for something dramatic. It wasn't building toward an event. It was settling into a pattern. And I was part of it. As the nights continued, the house's responses grew more refined. It no longer reacted to stillness alone. It reacted to how long I remained in it. Short pauses produced subtle changes. Longer ones reshaped entire rooms. I began noticing that when I stayed motionless for extended periods, the boundaries of the space around me felt less fixed. The distance between walls became harder to judge. The ceiling seemed both closer and farther away at the same time, as if depth itself had become flexible. I tested this carefully. I would sit in the same spot each evening, hands resting in the same position, eyes half closed, breathing slow. I resisted every impulse to move, even when discomfort crept in. When my legs tingled, when my shoulders tightened, I stayed still. The house responded with precision. The air grew smoother, more uniform. The sense of presence spread evenly through the room, no longer concentrated in any single direction. It felt as though the house had stopped observing me from the outside and had begun incorporating me into its internal balance. I noticed something else then. The house did not respond the same way every night. Some nights, the sensation arrived quickly and settled deeply. Other nights, it remained faint, distant, almost hesitant. At first, I thought this inconsistency meant I was imagining things. Then I realized the difference wasn't the house. It was me. On nights when my thoughts were scattered, when I carried fragments of the day with me into stillness, the house remained cautious. The presence stayed shallow, as if waiting for my mind to quiet completely. But when I arrived at stillness empty, without expectation or resistance, the house responded fully. It wasn't reacting to my body. It was reacting to my state. That understanding changed the way I approached the nights. I stopped trying to force stillness and instead allowed it to arrive naturally. I let thoughts pass without following them. I let discomfort exist without responding to it. The house seemed to approve. The presence deepened on those nights, settling into a steady, encompassing awareness that felt less like observation and more like coexistence. I no longer felt separate from the space around me. The distinction between where I ended and where the house began became increasingly abstract. I didn't feel lost. I felt held. Time behaved even more strangely then. Entire stretches of the night passed without memory. I would lie down, close my eyes, and open them again to find hours had slipped by unnoticed. There were no dreams to mark the passage. No images. No stories. Just continuity. In that continuity, the house felt complete. And I began to sense that this state, this shared stillness, was what the house had been designed for all along. I began to realize that the house was no longer responding to me. It was responding through me. This understanding came slowly, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet shift in perspective. I noticed it one night as I lay awake, eyes closed, breathing shallow, listening to the steady stillness that had become so familiar. The presence didn't arrive anymore. It was already there. There was no moment of transition, no subtle change in the air, no deepening of silence. The house existed in a constant state of awareness now, as if it no longer needed to wait for me to become still. It assumed I would. And it was right. I stopped resisting that assumption. I allowed my nights to unfold without interruption, without testing boundaries or timing reactions. Stillness became the default state rather than something I consciously entered. The house adjusted accordingly. Rooms felt more coherent, as if their shapes had stabilized around this new pattern. The living room, where I spent most evenings, felt smaller but more complete, like a space designed for a single purpose. The bedroom felt deeper, layered, its darkness no longer empty but textured. Even the hallway outside my door felt different. Not narrower. Not longer. More intentional. During the day, I noticed that movement inside the house felt slightly out of place. Standing up too quickly, walking too fast, even turning my head abruptly created a faint sense of resistance, as if the space preferred smoother transitions. I slowed down. It felt easier. The house rewarded that choice with balance. The presence remained steady, unobtrusive, integrated into the background of my awareness. It no longer felt like something separate from the environment. It felt like an extension of it. An underlying state. At night, my dreams changed again. They no longer featured rooms or hallways or darkness. Instead, they were filled with sensations. The feeling of pressure without weight. The sense of being surrounded without confinement. Awareness without focus. I wasn't observing anything. I was participating. Sometimes, I woke during the night and couldn't immediately tell whether my eyes were open or closed. The darkness felt identical on both sides. The presence didn't shift when I moved between waking and sleep. It remained constant. I tested something once, without really intending to. One night, lying still, I focused on the idea of movement without actually moving. I imagined sitting up, standing, walking down the hallway. My body remained perfectly still, but the thought itself felt deliberate. The house reacted. Not sharply. Not dramatically. But unmistakably. The presence tightened slightly, becoming more concentrated, as if registering a change in internal state rather than physical action. The air felt denser for a moment, then slowly relaxed again as my thoughts settled. That was when I understood something critical. The house was no longer tracking my body. It was tracking my intention. That realization carried weight. Not fear, exactly, but consequence. Movement had once been the boundary. Now even the idea of movement created a response. I stopped experimenting after that. Not because I felt threatened, but because the balance felt fragile in a way that demanded care. The house had adapted to me, and I had adapted to it, and disrupting that equilibrium felt unnecessary. The nights grew longer. Not in duration, but in perception. Time stretched thin, losing its markers. I couldn't say how long I lay awake or how deeply I slept. The transitions blurred together until they felt irrelevant. The house existed. I existed. That felt sufficient. Occasionally, during the day, I would step outside briefly, just to confirm that the world beyond the walls still followed familiar rules. The contrast was always jarring. Noise felt sharp. Movement felt excessive. Space felt poorly defined, chaotic. I never stayed outside long. Returning inside felt like exhaling after holding my breath. The house welcomed me back without ceremony. The presence resumed its steady state, neither increasing nor diminishing, simply continuing. One night, as I lay still, suspended in that familiar awareness, I felt the first hint of something new. Not a reaction. Not an adjustment. An expectation. It wasn't directed at me in the way earlier sensations had been. It felt broader, less specific, as if the house was preparing for a condition rather than an action. I didn't know what that condition was. But I sensed that once it arrived, stillness alone would no longer be enough. The expectation lingered without urgency. It didn't press against me. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed, settled into the structure of the house the same way stillness had once settled into me. I could feel it most clearly during the long stretches of night when nothing happened at all, when time seemed to thin out and lose its shape. I understood then that the house wasn't waiting for movement. It was waiting for consistency. Stillness had been the beginning. Awareness had been the refinement. Now something deeper was forming, something that required neither action nor intention. Presence. I stopped leaving the house altogether after that. Not because I felt trapped, and not because the outside world had disappeared. I knew it was still there. I could feel it faintly through the walls, distant and indistinct, like a memory rather than a place. Inside felt complete. The house no longer reacted in noticeable ways. There were no changes in pressure, no shifts in air density, no sense of adjustment. Everything felt stable, balanced, as if the environment had reached a configuration it no longer needed to modify. The presence didn't fade. It integrated. I moved through the room slowly, carefully, not out of fear but out of instinct. Sudden movement felt unnecessary now, almost disruptive. Each step carried weight, not physically, but contextually, as if motion itself had meaning again. At night, sleep came easily. There were no dreams. Not empty sleep, but uninterrupted continuity. I would lie down, close my eyes, and exist in a state that felt neither awake nor asleep. Thoughts drifted without forming narratives. Awareness remained diffuse, evenly spread. The house remained with me. Not watching. Not listening. Sharing. I noticed that I had stopped thinking of the space as separate from myself. The boundaries that once defined rooms and walls and ceilings felt conceptual rather than real. They still existed, but they no longer felt like limits. The house didn't contain me. It accompanied me. One night, during a long stretch of awareness, I realized that the expectation had resolved itself. There was no moment of fulfillment, no clear signal that something had happened. The feeling simply dissolved, leaving behind a calm that felt final in a way nothing before it had. The house was no longer waiting. It had learned what it needed. I understood then that the house had never wanted control, or attention, or permanence. It had been incomplete, and stillness had allowed it to recognize that. My presence, extended over time without resistance, had given it a reference point. A rhythm. Now it had won. In the days that followed, subtle changes returned to the house. Sounds reappeared, faint and familiar. Wood settled again. Pipes whispered occasionally. The air felt lighter, less concentrated. Normal. But the normality felt deliberate, chosen rather than default. I noticed that I could move more freely now without disrupting anything. The space no longer resisted abrupt motion. Stillness was no longer required to maintain balance. The house had internalized it. I slept deeply again, and when dreams returned, they were ordinary. Fragmented images. Fading impressions. Nothing that lingered after waking. The presence remained, but it had become passive, embedded in the structure of the place rather than active within it. Like a memory the house carried quietly. One morning, I stood in the living room as sunlight filled the space, and I realized that I could leave if I wanted to. The thought felt neutral, neither encouraged nor discouraged. The house would remain complete without me. That realization didn't sadden me. It felt right. I stayed anyway. Not because the house needed me, and not because I needed it, but because the stillness I had learned there followed me now, existing independently of the walls that had first revealed it. Even when I move, even when I speak, even when I leave the room, that quiet awareness remains. Sometimes, when the world grows too loud, I stop. And I feel it again. Not the house itself, but the space it taught me how to inhabit.